Hello and welcome to Back to Work, the podcast from Yo. I'm your host, Joe McIntyre, and on this podcast, we talk about returning a workforce back to normal during and after COVID-19. This is part 2 of our discussion with Kirt Walker, Yo's Vice President of HR. During part 1, we talked to Kirt about some of the challenges that businesses will face and have faced in bringing employees back to the workplace. So, Kirt, let's turn the tables a little bit following our discussion in part 1. We talked a lot about the challenges that businesses face. Now, what about those challenges that employees face? Professional growth was a particular challenge for many over the past year. What are some tips you believe can help employees grow professionally as we move forward here?
So the first thing, and I love this question too because I love employee development, the first thing is the employee needs to own their development. Yes, managers and companies have a big role, and I'll talk about that in a second, but the employee owns their development. The employee can't be a passive observer of their own development either. So the employee needs to articulate what competencies they need to work on and where they want to go with their career. They need to seek out the tough assignments that are going to challenge them. They can't be like a river that just goes through the path of least resistance. Have to find the challenging assignments. And in addition to just staying current in their craft, seeking out feedback and learning from their manager and or other mentors. Where there are challenges, like right now, there are a ton of opportunities. So the opportunities are out there. So now about the managers. Managers have another huge impact on development. So employees need to seek out companies and leaders who will give them candid feedback. I get really concerned when I see feedback, particularly in performance reviews or in other documents, the managers give to their employees, and the manager only talks about the great things that the employee is doing, the activity that the employee is doing. But there's nothing, absolutely nothing about areas where the employee can improve. Managers have to give that candid feedback. Finally, I'm a big fan of the scientific method when it comes to development. In other words, develop a hypothesis or a challenge. I want to achieve X by the end of the year. Zero in on where you are right now. Really study that and be introspective about where you are and get the feedback from mentors and managers and other stakeholders. And as you really focus in on where you are right now, you're going to find areas that you need to improve. Pick one of those areas, the biggest one. Design a little micro experiment, something that you can do in a day. Could be a conversation you need to have, a new way of doing something, and conduct that experiment. So you do it, then reflect on what happened, what was the result, and what did you learn? And then you do the next experiment the next day. So doing a little experiments regularly, almost on a daily basis or as much as possible, those are going to yield better results than doing these infrequent big experiments once a month or once a quarter or twice a year. There's a great book out there by Mike Rother that I really ascribe to around Toyota Kata, and it's really applicable to employee development.
So, Kirt, you talked a lot about the importance of leadership now more than ever. Why is having good leaders and good managers in place right now in 2021 so important?
As I've mentioned, people will and should seek out leaders who are going to challenge them and respect them. With more flexibility in geography, the more ability to work remotely, employees are going to have more options for employment. So employers and leaders really need to answer the question, why does someone want to come work for me? Answer that question, and in essence, they themselves do that experimentation too. We'll work on that every day a little bit to get better.
Now, Kirt, switching gears a little bit, do you think remote work is here to stay permanently? And if so, how do you feel employers should manage expectations of future employees and those on staff now?
I think there's going to be more remote work. Real estate footprints are going to reduce, but I'm not ready yet to plan the funeral of the office. Companies have realized that they can maintain more productivity with a remote workforce, but we've also learned that working from home can come with a price. There are a lot of concerns right now about mental health. We found that when there is little to no separation between home and office, some employees tend to have a tough time turning off the office, and they burn themselves out. There are many companies and managers out there still who firmly believe in team and office concept for a long-term strategy. So I do see more flexibility in allowing more employees to work from home with some frequency, but the data suggests that it won't be the level that we have been experiencing over the last year. So I look at data from the Fed in Atlanta. They have some really good data that they publish, right? Prior to COVID, and they published the data, percent of total work days that were done remotely. Prior to COVID, it was 5.5%. When COVID began, it jumped up to 23%, a huge, huge jump. But as they survey leaders going forward, anticipate that that will drop back down to about 13.6%, right? So still a large increase from pre-COVID days, but not nearly what we have seen from the last few months. So it's going to increase, just not at the same levels. Biggest thing, though, is to set expectations, monitor performance closely, and do it on an individual basis. In other words, be careful of we notice some employees haven't been productive at home, so now everyone has to come back to the office. Instead, handle the employees that aren't functioning well or aren't performing well. Talk to them about their performance, and if it is required, bring them back into the office as sort of a corrective action because of their performance.
Now, you mentioned the need to add more flexibility. Certainly that makes a ton of sense. How should companies do that? How should they add additional flexibility for their employees?
Safety, again, is the number one concern. I've had so many employees talk to me that they want to return to the office, but they won't until the vaccine is fully distributed. Employers need to make sure that the employees have masks and plenty of soap in places to clean their hands. So do those things around sanitation. Ensure there are barriers where appropriate, like I talked about before in the lunchrooms and things like that. But be careful with some of the barriers. I've seen employers put up barriers so that people can't hear each other, right? And so that simple step prevented the conversations, and so then people would go to the side of the barrier to have their conversations and get closer to each other. So in actuality, that became more of a problem than anything that it solved, right? So look for ways that we can keep people safe and the hygiene. Keep the face masks and the soap handy.
Now, in a similar vein of safety, a recent study says that private U.S. companies do have the right under the law to require employees to get vaccinated against COVID-19. Some may be unlikely to do so because of the risks of both legal and even cultural backlash. What are some tips for companies to consider when determining their vaccination policy?
Yeah, first is to be clear with why we have this policy and communicate it. So, for example, a care facility has a pretty compelling reason to tell its employees that they have to be vaccinated. But that reason doesn't quite hold as much water if you're talking just about a general office setting, right? So it's clear, though, that we have to accommodate. But it's rarely black and white. So employers will need to navigate the gray areas of religious accommodation, disability accommodation, those kinds of things. I think it will be difficult, though, for most employers to put a blanket requirement out there. We typically don't require documentation for other vaccines. So hopefully enough people will follow the science and get vaccinated that it will help everyone else. But employers are just going to have to be flexible and watch very closely and communicate effectively with their employees.
So, Kirt, we're coming up to the end of our first episode here, which I think has been a fantastic conversation so far. And as we kind of close this out, what are some of your takeaways for companies hiring in 2021? Maybe a couple tips, suggestions, some thoughts on the best ways to approach this moving forward.
It boils down to the leadership, right? Leadership. It's tough out there. It's going to get tougher for employers to find enough qualified employees that will come work for them. So the leadership is critical. Again, why would an employee want to come work for me or for my company? Leaders who can balance that performance requirement and the development are going to be gold. So find those leaders now and get them in place so that in the next few months, as we go forward in the tight labor market, we will be able to attract and retain those employees that are available.
Well, Kirt, I want to thank you so much for sharing your insights into employers and employees as they return to work in 2021. You shared a ton of great information and a lot of useful information for Yo clients, certainly, but also anyone considering bringing their employees back to work. Thank you also to our listeners for tuning in to Yo's Back to Work podcast. To hear future episodes of the podcast, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you listen in. For Yo's Back to Work, I'm Joe McIntyre. Thanks for listening.